how do we be culturally relevant, biblically rooted, living out our faith, not hiding it, not, going around like little church mice and just leaving well enough alone kind of thing. How do we talk about these things that are controversial, that are personal, in a way that still acknowledges the humanity of the person in front of us? Hi, welcome to Wild and Beautiful. We're Joanna Hyatt and Lauren Enriquez, your co-hosts who every week are helping you live out your faith in a way that's biblically rooted but culturally relevant. My kids have this readathon that happens every January. So they have to read, a ton of hours. And I noticed my daughter was reading Little Women, and it reminded me that the first time they read Little Women, because, we have a few daughters, so we've been through this book a bit, was a version that someone had given us. It was like a young reader's Little Women. And so they read the book, and I kind of skimmed through it, and I realized the book ends before Beth dies, right?
No, that's the most important part.
Kind of important, right? I'm thinking, ooh, this could be problematic. Well, like 6 months later, we watched Little Women, and I didn't remember that they had not understood the full story.
Version.
So there was this moment in the movie, of course, when Beth dies, and my girls just went, wait, what? Why are there flower petals on the bed? Where's Beth? And you're going, So I just want to say, I know when we try to make these youth versions, it's to introduce children to good literature, but sometimes we go too far and we hold back the parts that are painful. And then these children have these traumatic experiences when they find out that's not the full story.
Yeah. And I feel like they're doing that a lot more today than they used to. Because I was just looking at a recap of all the all the movies that the elder millennials grew up on. And they're all traumatizing. Yeah. They're all traumatizing and really sad. It's Little Women and The Lion King and E.T. and all these
Land
movies.
Before Time.
Land Before Time, where your parent dies or your best friend leaves, or My Girl, your best friend dies of bee stings. I would never show my kids these movies. And I'm like, well, I guess I turned out okay. Maybe it's fine. But I don't know, something has changed a lot in the last couple decades.
But I wonder, are we doing kids any favors? I mean, there's a certain age, of course. You don't want to devastate your children at 3. But I do think at a certain point, the reason stories are so good and literature is classic, we consider a piece classic, is because it doesn't sugarcoat. It shows that there is hardship. I mean, my daughter the other day, love it. She's reading an abridged version of Tale of Two Cities. And she goes, oh, this is one of my favorite stories. I'm like, Tale of Two Cities? That's such a violent.
Good.
But it is pretty good. I thought, well, there's a case where they actually did a good job. I mean, it opens up with the streets ran red with blood. I'm like, there it is. Okay. So I do think you can still introduce kids to great literature without having to be necessarily as extensive as the literature may be, and still help them understand the themes of what's happening, and not have them just be so shocked when they see someone
the real
died.
version.
Guys, we're not even talking about storytelling today, but this was a nice long opener on children's books.
Yes.
It's fitting though to what we are talking about today, because Lauren and I have been having this conversation, and I asked for us to talk about this because I'm still sorting it out in my mind and my heart. So you all get an inside glimpse into sort of real-time processing of one of these bigger questions that I'm wrestling with. And so the question is today, as Christians, how are we to engage with the world when the world right now is pretty controversial, in the sense that you can't hardly mention anything without someone getting mad at you. Issues seem to dominate the headlines, and ultimately it's back to the kind of mission of what Wild and Beautiful is, which is, how do we be culturally relevant, biblically rooted, living out our faith, not hiding it, not, going around like little church mice and just leaving well enough alone kind of thing. How do we talk about these things that are controversial, that are personal, in a way that still acknowledges the humanity of the person in front of us? And before we get into what sparked that question for me, if you've been a listener for a while, please don't forget to rate, and review this podcast to ensure that more people get to have these deep, thought-provoking conversations. Okay, so that's the question we're tackling today, because I think, Lauren, you and I are more like, yeah, you got to speak on the issues. Hello. Like, what's the point if you're not talking about the issues?
We were talking about this recently with another one of our friends and kind of came to the realization that the reason the three of us are so close is because we can have these conversations and it's not weird. And we kind of realize like, oh, it seems like a lot of people don't want to have these conversations. Yeah. So yeah, it's been really good to have friends that I can work through this stuff with. I can be wrong. I can get corrected. I can provide insight. And I've learned a lot from being able to talk through these things, but I don't know if people don't want to, they're just not interested, or if people don't have that, they don't have that sounding board. They don't feel free to like figure things out and talk through them. It's not just about, I'm going to go around saying what's true. It's, I need to figure out what's true by talking to people about it. And I don't think people even feel the freedom, maybe that's the wrong word, but they don't feel the freedom to do that with the people that they are with most of the time.
So that's probably the first, when we're saying like, how do we talk about this? First of all, are people talking about this? Mm-hmm. Our podcast specifically addresses this, and we know that those of you listening, you're thinking about this issue, but it is a question to say, in our everyday life, are these questions coming up? Mm-hmm. And I would say, if you branch out of like your really close group, hopefully in your close group, if you are someone like this, you've probably connected with people who are similar. Outside of it's not coming up. And the question there is it because people don't want to talk about it because they're not interested? Like, are we at a point right now where people aren't actually interested in discussing the issues? The issues being, yes, things that are in the headlines like abortion and immigration and gender theology, but also the issues being like, we're broken. The world is depraved. What do you believe about God? What is your position on XYZ? So that people are not even thinking about that, and we are just doing a good job being busy, or kind of to your point, like we don't know how, like we're interested, but we don't know how to talk about it, and so we stay silent.
And while you were talking, a third possibility came into my head, which is that there may be a lot, and I think this is especially true for women. I think there's a lot of women that don't even know that there is a whole world of conversation happening that they could engage in. And the reason I thought of that is because a few years ago, I was at a function where one of these things where you go and get a pedicure with like 20 other people. It was like a work
your favorite.
I like the pedicure.
Not the people.
So many people. But there were a bunch of us ladies together getting a pedicure, and there was a talk show on the TV in the salon, and Dr. Jordan Peterson came on the screen. And I was like, guys, wow. Dr. Peterson is on this, like, because it was so weird to see him. It was like The View or something. It was like one of these women's daytime talk shows. And every single one of the women just looked at me and was like, who's Dr. Peterson? And then two ladies were like, oh yeah, my husband watches him. And I have found that a lot, like when there are these interesting conversations that people are working through, a lot of times it's the men having the conversations. And this is not a feminist statement at all, or like an anti-man statement, but I don't know. I'm just observing, because we're going to work through this together. I'm just observing that a lot of these conversations are happening among men and seem not to be happening among women, and women don't even seem to know they're going on.
Well, and this also goes to one of the reasons I wanted to start this podcast, which is I feel like there's not a lot of places for Christian women who are ambitious. And I don't mean that in that, like, I don't just mean for a job, for instance, because that can be taken the wrong way.
Right.
So growing up, I always felt like I was too much probably for the church in the kind of the general sense. My dad has always done a fantastic job being like, be you, girl. This is great. But just feeling like, man, I've got goals. I've got dreams. I'm outspoken. Yeah. High school me, a little rough around the edges. Mm-hmm. But then as I got into a secular college and then tried to date after that, felt like, man, I'm too Jesus loving for the world. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, I am living out what feminists purport to be for, and I believe everything feminists hate.
Isn't that odd?
Uh-huh. And so wanting to create a space where women can come together and say, we too wrestle with these issues, because we are actually the ones, influencing the community, not just from a leadership, but like a grassroots level, whether that's raising our kids, whether that's volunteering, whether that's the professions we choose. Women generally are more relational. And so actually thinking about these issues, talking about these issues, intentionally being involved matters because it's impacting actually so much. But I'm with you. Like, it's not a common thing. I mean, we're kind of like the odd women out.
Yeah. But you raised a really good point that women are more relational. And I will say in my personal, experience, this is just anecdotal, this is not data, but in my experience, having conversations with a lot of different women at my gym on a daily basis, what I find is where the opinionated conservative woman comes out is when her children come up. So it comes out in she's not happy about something that the school did. It comes out in what's going on the sports team. That mama bear who is brave enough to have an opinion and state it comes out when her family when she feels like her family is being threatened. And I would love to extend that bravery to her to weigh in on other topics. Because I will say I do overhear a lot of guys talking about economics and politics and things that the women just seem more interested in talking about where they bought their shoes and I'm not criticizing that. I have this quandary in my head of, do they want to engage in these more controversial topics and feel like they can't? Have they not been exposed to them and don't know that it's like really fun to engage in them, or something else?
Okay, here's another thought. Again, friends, we're processing this in real time because we want you to understand this is part of how you approach issues that you're like, I don't have a firm answer.
Yeah.
So one thing I've noticed when I engage on these issues, man, this is gonna get me into hot water with like all kinds of feminists, but
for the 42nd thousand
for the
time.
42nd time, yeah. It's how do I say this and not? I can't. I am just. Men can talk about an issue that they disagree on and walk out of that room and still be friends, and they don't take it personally.
That's
and
true.
It is a very rare thing. I have one friend. She's fantastic. We are totally on opposite sides, and we can get together for coffee, and we can have a great conversation about abortion and healthcare and Christianity and all of that stuff and still walk out of their friends. But it is actually a rare thing I find to have a conversation with another female and not have her get personally defensive or feel like it's attacked. I mean, it happened the other day to me with a gal I've known for 20-something years. And I posted something and she's like, she wrote me separately, I'm so hurt that you didn't come to me, blah, blah, blah. And I said, I've actually come to you before. And I asked if we could have a conversation, mainly because I just wanted to understand. I wasn't trying to change your mind. I just had questions. And you specifically said, I am not interested and I don't need to explain to you why I believe what I believe. I said, so I didn't really think coming to you again would result in anything different. And so I wonder if there's something about the female, could be temperament, could be even like we don't realize we've internalized this idea of like women are supposed to be more demure, And so a woman who says, no, let's talk about it. Like I disagree, but I'd like to understand, makes us uncomfortable.
Yeah. It sounds from listening to what you're saying, I'm getting the impression that women identify more of themselves with their positions, if that makes sense. Like their positions become a part of their identity for us in a way that maybe they don't for men. Maybe, men can compartmentalize things better than we can. This is a fact. Maybe they're able to dissociate their identity as a person from their opinion on a controversial issue better than we can. And I think that might be a good thing when it comes to women, that we're integrating our beliefs into our identity, but we still have to be able to separate ourselves from them enough to question and seek truth and allow ourselves to be formed, and acknowledge when maybe we have a position that needs to change, or at least be willing to explain why we believe what we believe to someone else without feeling like they're calling it into question as an attack on us as an individual.
Yeah. Yeah. And so maybe that's where, for us, it makes it difficult to have conversations because there's not always that like, oh yeah, we can have a dispassionate or we can have a passionate conversation, but I walk out of here, you've heard the waffle and spaghetti theory, men and women. Have you heard this? So
No.
women are like spaghetti. I mean, again, we're generalizing all the angry calls. Women are like spaghetti in that, everything is interconnected for us. And to your point, that can be a really good thing. Like when we go to make a decision, we understand, well, it's going to affect this over here. And it's going to have an impact on that. We need to just be mindful of that. That's just how God wired us. Guys are much more like a waffle. Everything's a box. So when they walk into that box, they're very much in that box. They're focused, they're present. They're not actually thinking about a lot of the other stuff, which as women, you're like, how is that possible? But for guys, that means when they're in that box where they're like, let's discuss politics.
Totally.
They're not also going, and I also want to discuss your feelings and I want to discuss your past history and your own related trauma. And they're like, a what? We're just discussing this issue.
I think that's very true. And
so that could be it too.
I have to make a confession that Joe and I watch backstage the Daily Wire conversations where all the hosts, who all happen to be male, except for an occasional appearance by Candace Owens, get together and they talk about kind of like the news of the day and they get into heated debates. And I get like angry watching the people I disagree with share their opinions. And I'm like yelling at my phone, like, no, this is why you're wrong. And that's not what the data says. And the guys are just sitting there sipping their whiskey. And then they'll snipe at each other and make really biting, not personal attacks, but they will like demolish people's arguments. And then they just like move on to the next topic and start laughing about something else. You're totally right. The waffle analogy is great because I feel like even if I were in that situation, I would walk away like, well, he's not my friend anymore.
Because you've seen all the way, this is not going to work. And they're like, we had a great conversation. When are we getting together again?
Yeah.
Which, by the way, ladies, for those of you who maybe, are married or you're not married, but you want to date, there's also a box for guys that's a nothing box. So sometimes they're in that box. This is a pro tip for you. And they're literally thinking about nothing. And you can ask a guy,
really?
What are you thinking? Oh, yes. Try it the next time Jose is like zoning out. Be like, what are you thinking about? And he might actually say, nothing.
That's so, I can't even fathom.
No, we cannot. We cannot fathom. I'm like, nothing? Which is probably why men never ask their wives, what are you thinking? Yeah. So anyway, just, they mean it. Don't be offended. It's just, and it's kind of great. I don't know how you get there. But anyway, it's a whole long different conversation about men and women. So that's the starting point of like, are people talking about it? Why don't they talk about it? Here was the slide that got me thinking, though, down this rabbit trail. And I'm not going to say who posted it, but it was posted on Instagram. And this is a Christian person who has a fairly large following. So there's lots of people engaging on this. And listen, I know, again, I tend to come from a justice warrior type of thing, but not in like a social justice progressive. And so one of the statements was, 2023, walking with people over standing on issues, being more of a human and less of an opinion. And I read that and I thought, okay, sounds nice. Nice. But something is not sitting right with me. And so that's what got me thinking about it because, again, we talk about the issues here. And one of the issues that we will always talk about is abortion. And abortion for a lot of people is one of the most uncomfortable issues to discuss. Yeah. And so, I read that and I thought, walking with people over standing on issues. Now, to this person's credit, I actually wrote on the comments. I said, clarifying question. Does this mean we don't ever talk about the issues? Or we talk about them with humility, knowing that people have their life experiences, all this. The latter, of course. I thought, yes, of course, but I don't ever see a lot of I see this a lot in Christianity, mainstream Christianity right now. Maybe it's more evangelicals. This like, we just want to talk about hope and how to be good humans. And in doing so, we're walking with people, not issues, but then either the issues don't ever come up or when they do, at least to me, they seem progressive. Like the discussion of the issue actually misses some of the the centrality, the central moral pieces involved in the issue.
Yeah.
Is this making sense?
Yes. I would say immigration is a really good example because I would imagine that a person who would post that meme wouldn't have a problem with saying we need to open the borders or grant amnesty.
Yeah.
They would probably have an issue with saying we need to reform the process and make sure that everyone who is crossing should be here.
And yet, we
Mhm.
know that actually the open borders are causing unbelievable amounts of rape and attacks and even deaths of women and children. And so
Mhm.
in standing for people, if you do not stand well on the issue, you harm people.
Right. And it seems like the meme is basically meme, graphic, whatever, the quote that you read is trying to shut down conversation more than encourage it. And the conversation is really important because both sides of the Christian debate, if you want to split it into liberal and conservative, they both have good intentions and they both want flourishing for humans. They're looking at different data sets usually in order to come to the conclusion that they've reached. And if we can't share that data with one another, I mean, I've had leftist friends share data with me that I didn't know about that changed my opinion because I'd only been exposed to different data, right? If you're saying we stand with people and not issues, I would feel kind of uncomfortable bringing my data to you and asking for your data and having a conversation and reaching our shared goal of human flourishing together, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm thinking too, when I look at scripture, this is how I read it. When I look at the Old Testament, New Testament, the whole of scripture together, what I see is God standing on the issues because he is for people.
Mm-hmm.
So like pick up the book of Amos, friends. I don't know if you've read that one lately. He's blasting in no uncertain terms. These are the things that you have done. You have ripped children out of the wombs. Oh, hi, abortion. You have basically hurt the foreigner. I think that's elsewhere in the Old Testament. That matters for immigration. You have been adulterous. You have sought other idols. Paul talks to the Corinthians like, hey, stop sleeping with your mother-in-law or whatever it is. Like, we call out the issues because to call out the issue is to call out sin in order to also show people their need for a savior. So as I've thought about this, I think, again, friends, we're processing this in real time. I think as people, we might be more inclined, we're either more inclined towards justice or mercy, right? Like, think about yourself as you're listening. Like, am I somebody that has a natural bent towards justice or a natural bent towards mercy? I just think one comes probably more easily than the other, and we have to work on it. I absolutely towards justice. I have to work on mercy, compassion, grace.
Yeah.
And if you surround yourself, to your data point thing, if you surround yourself with people that are like you, well, if you only surround yourself with justice people, you will become harsh. And if you only surround yourself with mercy people, you will become soft on sin and brokenness and what is happening in this world. And that's, I think, why God tells us in the Old Testament, he said, what is it? Do justice and love mercy.
Yeah.
We are to hold those things together, which is also why, one, the body collectively is important. Now, you and I are more justice people. Do we have anyone in our we don't have anyone in our close circle. It's more mercy oriented. But you have those friends to say like, hey, there might be these reasons people make this decision. You're like, okay, you're right. The other thing I've been thinking is, shouldn't Christians be the ones modeling how to have discussions on issues?
Yes.
Like, who else is going to do it well?
Well, and if you look at scripture, Paul does it really well.
Yeah.
He engages and there's conflict and they work through it. And sometimes they don't and they just hate each other at the end.
And they leave the church.
On the justice and mercy part, this comes back because I've thought a lot about this throughout my life, especially because there's the Saint Faustina, who's the saint of divine mercy. And she was another modern saint. She wrote about these conversations she would basically have with Jesus in her diary, and it was published and it's beautiful. But during the time that she was writing, there was a lot more emphasis on justice, and things were much more just harsh. The hierarchy was really emphasized. Children were they were kind of being kept away from the sacraments until they were older. Like this the aspect of God of mercy was just not incorporated enough. And that's, I think, why God chose to have these conversations with her. And justice and mercy are both attributes of God. He is justice and he is mercy. So they're not really at conflict with each other. His justice is his mercy. This was his message to St. Faustina. You have to focus on my mercy because my mercy is just. We don't deserve his mercy. He grants it to us, and his justice comes from the fact that he gave us free will, and we choose the path that we want to take, and he respects our choice. Yeah. So our justice is really, anyway, you can read a lot more about it, but for me, it always comes back to that prayer to see people the way that he sees them. I want to have, where I'm more justice oriented, you could say, focusing more on the black and right, the white and wrong, the what's wrong with this picture, and let me correct it. And hopefully let me be corrected when I'm wrong. But I think that prayer that applies to so many things, let me see people the way that you see them, can help us in this regard too. Let me ask the questions. Let me have a heart that's willing to be changed if different facts are brought to my attention. And let me not, to the credit of the person who wrote that quote, let me not just see people, let me not see people through the lens of the issue, on where they stand on an issue. Let me see them as a person. And because the person is an immortal soul, the issue is something that's going to change and evolve with time, depending on what the facts of the situation are at the time. Again, a little all over the place, but some thoughts I have on justice versus mercy.
Well, and to the credit of the person who wrote that thing, it did get me thinking, because I am always having to just check, like, Lord, I know it's easy for me to see what's right and what's wrong. And so often it's not the person involved in the issue that's getting lost. Like when we're talking about abortion, I can see the woman who has had an abortion or the abortion worker. When we're talking about immigration, when we're talking about poverty, I can see the person that I understand. Yeah. But I know it can come off sounding like I don't see the person who disagrees with me. I don't see their humanity. I don't see the potentially validity in their positions. Because I have the kind of personality that just sounds very confident in whatever I'm talking about, even if I'm making it up as I go along.
Well,
obviously,
and I will say
none
on
of this
abortion,
is made up, friends.
No, and on abortion, the confidence is warranted. The confidence in knowing that it is wrong to kill a preborn child.
Oh, well, and I think that's the distinction of like, even in all of these issues, there are things that are always right and wrong. Yes. So abortion is always wrong. Abortion is absolutely the intentional killing of a distinctly separate human being. And that's not my opinion. That's facts and science.
Right.
But why women choose abortions is a little bit more complex. And so, in saying like, well, we stand with people before we stand with issues. And like, but we have to also stand on the issue. Again, this is the tension I'm wrestling through of like, well, let's take slavery, for instance. You're like, well, those were some really nice people. They treated their slaves well. Like, we now look back and we go, I don't care who you were. There's just zero justification for that. And yet we know that actually abolitionists were vilified in that time. They were
social outcasts. They were not approved of by a lot of church leaders.
No,
they were political pariah.
My pastor on Sunday, he goes, often the majority is usually wrong. I mean, look at the Old Testament when Moses sent the 12 spies into Canaan and said, tell us how the land is. And 10 of them come back, or 2 first come back, Joshua and Caleb. They're like, it's awesome. Yeah, big giants. We got this. God told us it's ours. 10 of them, 10 come back and go, they're too big for us. This isn't going to work. Blah, 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 blah. They turned the entire people of Israel grumbling against what God had said. So you have a majority of 99.99995%. And they were wrong. And it cost them 40 years in the desert. Yeah. So friends, the majority is not always right. In fact, rarely are they right.
Right. It's true. And right now the majority is wrong on abortion, for example. Yeah. And we can say that confidently. I keep seeing these polls celebrating that most Americans are against abortion after the first trimester. And it's like, that's when they all happen. Like, that's not really a victory, guys. Abortion's not okay ever. And it's okay to say that. And I think that in 50 or 100 years, all of society is going to look back on the majority that supported abortion in the same exact way that we now look on the people who supported slavery, who are just mind-boggled how it's possible that this was a socially acceptable institution.
Yeah.
So we can stand on the experiences of people that came before us when these conversations get tense or when we're questioning, okay, am I loving enough when I take an objective stance on something? There are a lot of cases when it is absolutely okay to take that objective stance and, leave the rest in God's hands, because you will probably be persecuted for it or looked on as a weirdo, and that's okay.
Well, and in the issues to say, what is there a central moral truth? Like, moms get into arguments about like breastfed versus, bottle formula. Like, there's no central moral truth there. Did your child get fed? Congratulations, you did your job. So maybe that's the central moral truth. Like,
that's the definitive position, guys.
Are we arguing whether or not somebody got fed? Good job. But then, so then I think of like, okay, abortion. We just outlined that one. Let's take immigration. The immigrant, the foreigner, the refugee, they are not other. They are not less than. They are still made in the image of God. They still deserve dignity. So then, are we treating them with dignity in our approach? And then you can have a conversation. I would think, well, again, whoever wants to talk about, but then you say, okay, let's look at whether open borders or borders with very lax security, no system, people are just kind of caught and release. Does that promote the dignity of the individual coming in? We're not even getting into like national safety and the responsibility of government. Well, right now the evidence would say no. Okay, so then what does? So I still think, you could say in the issues of racism and the whole Black Lives Matter argument, like what is the central argument there? And then what is actually addressing that? And I find very rarely do people want to even talk about like, well, let's agree on the central thing and then figure out how we're solving the problem. And that's where I do think you would see more blending between this conservative, liberal within the church. I'm not talking about people outside of the church on this, friends.
Not talking about Congress or anything like that.
Within those of us who identify as followers of Jesus Christ, if we could say, well, what is the moral truth in this that we can agree on? Then we can figure out, well, how do we do that? Are we doing that? Are we not doing that kind of thing? But I don't even know that we're willing to have that conversation to say, well, let's drill down. And as people of the church, we should be able to say we have scripture, we have church history, we have rich history and writings that should inform our foundation and say, well, yeah, we agree on this. Now, how do we come to y'all listening to my processing in real time?
I love it. And we're going out on a limb for you guys here.
Because we want you to understand, like, we don't come to these episodes with like cut and like hard and fast answers. Some of this stuff, it's hard to work through. And that's the leading of the Holy Spirit to say, okay, some of us are going to be called to be more outspoken. And some of us are going to be called to be less outspoken. But I would hope even in our personal relationships, because ultimately that's where transformation is going to happen in a 1-to-1, 1-to-3. It's not going to be, no one's ever said like, wow, that social media post really just upended everything I thought. But we are still called to say like, well, what is the truth? And how do I weave that into my daily life?
Yeah. I observe that a lot of people choose their churches, and this is Catholic and Protestant, by the way. They choose their churches based on where the like-minded people are. And I think that's okay. It's not ideal. But it would be nice if there were an opportunity to really like trade notes with people who disagree I just don't think there's a really good forum for coming together as Christians and discussing. And a big part of the reason why I think that is because there's kind of a social media basically and the mass media have made these conversations a performance a lot of the conversations take place as, for example, and I know I've really witnessed this with like Baptist church leaders on Twitter, for example, going, having these theological debates. And it happens between like priests and bishops too, in the Catholic side, or just Catholic theologians, very much so Catholic theologians. They have these public debates on Twitter where it's not conducive to finding common ground or anyone's heart being moved, because the end goal of these performative theological conversations is winning the debate, not let's come together and see where the truth is. Let me find where my position is flawed. Show me your facts so that I can have facts I didn't have before, and I'll show you mine, which I think can happen in one-on-one settings or in settings where we're together personally and no one's recording, no one's live tweeting the conversation. But when a lot of theology moves to Twitter and moves to social media and moves to blogging wars where you have people just writing blogs back and forth against each other, it's when an audience gets involved, I think that degrades the conversation in a lot of ways. And I've just seen a lot of theological debate happen on social media that ended with basically a winner being declared through how many likes or retweets they got. And no one's heart changed at the end. In fact, a big part of the reason I left Twitter is because it was hurting my heart to see these things. It was making me more insular in my thinking. It was making me less open to changing my mind, because you get into this mindset that winning is the desired outcome rather than holiness.
Yeah.
So I think
and there's
that's
no room to
something
change your
changed.
mind. Once we put something out online, as has been shown, you will be now held to that for the next
the
2 decades of your life.
Last forever.
So unfortunately, that has also then created this environment where we can't actually say, we want to try to hash out the issues, understanding that people are involved.
Yeah.
And so it tamps down curiosity. And maybe for some people, that's why they don't want to talk about this stuff, because there's no room to say, I'm learning and I'm growing and I'm changing and the Holy Spirit's
It's either I'm going to
work.
win or I'm going to lose.
And I've got to know now everything I'm going to ever believe on this topic.
Yeah.
And that, oh man, that is just such an injustice to culture and to the church and to the ability to grow and advance and just our intellect. Like, it's just getting tamped down, silenced, shut off. So y'all, we could keep going on this because this is how we process. So yeah, we'd love to hear from you. Wildandbeautifulpodcast@gmail.com. What are your thoughts? Do you tend to land on the side of speaking up about issues? Do you err more on the side of like, I just want to bring, hope and love people, and I don't want to get issues and politics involved? And how, if you found a way that works, we'd love to know. Or if you're still figuring that out. And always, like, what are the issues you're struggling with, and how to be humane in those issues?
Yep. Love to hear it. I really would, especially on this topic. Like, if you're at the gym and a controversial issue comes up, like, do you want to engage? Are you afraid to engage? Are you completely disinterested? Like, this is a genuine quandary in my mind of like, why aren't we having these conversations more among each other? Why is it only on podcasts and like on Twitter that we see this stuff happening and not in real life?